The morning sun cast a golden glow over the vast fields of Henry Carter's farm. The air was thick with the scent of fresh soil and dewy grass as he guided his old rusted tractor across the land. Henry, a humble man in his late 50s, had spent his entire life working this farm, just like his father before him. He didn't have much, just a small weathered house, a barn filled with supplies, and a heart full of kindness. Despite the struggles of keeping the farm running, he never hesitated to lend a helping hand to anyone in need. That day started like any other, with Henry feeding the chickens and checking on his crops. But as he wiped the sweat off his brow, a strange sound echoed through the quiet countryside. It wasn't the usual hum of a distant truck or the rustling of trees. This was different. Loud, urgent, and unmistakably the screech of tires losing control. Henry turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a luxury car, a sleek, jet-black sports car, speeding down the narrow dirt road leading past his farm. Everything happened in seconds. The car swerved violently, kicking up dust as it skidded off the road and plowed into a ditch. Henry's heart pounded. Without hesitation, he dropped his tools and sprinted toward the wreckage. As he neared, he saw the driver slumped over the wheel, motionless. The front of the car was crumpled against a tree, steam rising from the hood. "Hey, you all right in there?" Henry called, tugging at the jammed door. The man inside, a sharply dressed figure in a suit that probably cost more than Henry made in a year, groaned weakly. He was barely conscious. Henry didn't waste a second. Using all the strength he had, he yanked the door open and carefully pulled the man out. His expensive watch glinted in the sunlight, his breathing shallow. Blood trickled from a small cut on his forehead, but he was alive. Henry laid him on the soft grass and checked his pulse. "Stay with me now," he muttered, patting the man's cheek lightly. The stranger blinked, his eyes unfocused. What happened?" he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "You crashed, son," Henry said simply. "But you're lucky to be breathing." A few minutes later, the sound of sirens broke the quiet. Henry had already called for help, and the ambulance arrived just in time. The paramedics rushed to the injured man, stabilizing him before loading him onto the stretcher. Before they drove off, the man, still groggy, looked at Henry, a flicker of recognition in his tired eyes. "You saved me," he whispered. Henry simply tipped his hat. Just did what anyone would do. With that, the ambulance sped off, leaving Henry standing there, watching the dust settle. He sighed, shaking his head as he turned back toward his farm. To him, it was just another day, another moment where doing the right thing didn't need a second thought. But the next morning, something happened that Henry never expected. As the sun rose over his farm, he walked out to begin his usual chores. But there, parked right in front of his old barn, was a sight so out of place that he had to blink twice just to believe it. A brand new cherry red Ferrari gleamed in the morning light, its sleek curves and polished exterior standing in stark contrast to the rugged farmland around it. Henry's jaw dropped. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone step out and explain why a car like this was sitting on his property. And then he saw it, a note taped to the windshield. With cautious steps, he approached and peeled it off. In bold, neat handwriting, the words sent a chill down his spine. "For the man who saved my life, this is just the beginning." Henry stared at the message, his mind racing. Who was that man he had pulled from the wreckage? And what did he mean by just the beginning? Little did Henry know, his life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. Henry stood there, staring at the Ferrari, as if it might disappear if he blinked. He had never seen a car like this up close, let alone had one parked in front of his barn. His calloused fingers ran over the sleek, smooth surface, feeling the cold metal under his touch. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave this here? And what did that note mean? His mind raced back to the man he had pulled from the wreck. The way he had looked at Henry before the ambulance took him away. It was almost like he had wanted to say more. Maybe this was his way of saying thanks. But a gift like this, it was too much. Henry was a man who had spent his whole life working with his hands, earning every dollar through sweat and hard labor. He didn't need fancy cars or grand gestures. Still, curiosity got the better of him. He looked around, expecting someone to pop out and say it was all a mistake. But there was no one. Just the stillness of the morning, the distant sound of cows lowing in the pasture. Henry sighed, shaking his head. He had work to do, and this wasn't going to plow his fields or feed his animals. But as he turned away, the distant hum of an approaching vehicle made him pause. A sleek black SUV rolled up his driveway, kicking up dust as it came to a stop near the Ferrari. The door opened, and a tall, well-dressed man stepped out. He wasn't the man Henry had saved, but there was something about him, his sharp suit, the way he moved with confidence, that told Henry he was connected. The man walked up with an easy smile, offering his hand. "Mr. Carter, I presume," he said. Henry wiped his hands on his worn jeans before shaking it. "That's me. And you are?" "Jacob Sterling," the man replied. "I work for Mr. Donovan." Henry's brow furrowed. "Donovan? That the man from the crash?" Jacob nodded. "Yes, Charles Donovan. I believe you saved his life yesterday." Henry shrugged. "Did what anyone would do." Jacob chuckled. "Maybe, but not everyone would have acted so fast. Mr. Donovan is a very wealthy man, Mr. Carter. Powerful too. He doesn't take kindness lightly. That car," he gestured toward the Ferrari, "is a small token of his gratitude." Henry let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I appreciate it, but I can't accept something like this. I don't need a fancy car." Jacob smiled, as if he had expected that answer. "That's understandable, but Mr. Donovan insists. And he's not a man who likes to take no for an answer." Something about the way he said it made Henry's stomach tighten. Before Henry could respond, Jacob reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it over. "Mr. Donovan would also like to meet you, personally. He's currently recovering at his estate. If you have time, he'd love for you to visit." Henry took the envelope reluctantly. It was thick, heavier than he expected. He opened it and his breath caught. Inside was a stack of crisp $100 bills, more money than Henry had seen in a long time. His fingers stiffened around the envelope. I can't take this either," he said firmly, holding it out. Jacob didn't reach for it. "It's not a payment, it's a thank you. No strings attached." He paused, then added, "But Mr. Donovan would still like to see you." Henry hesitated. Something about this didn't sit right. He wasn't used to this world of wealth, where people threw around cars and stacks of money like it was nothing. But at the same time, saying no felt wrong. The man just wanted to thank him. What harm could come from meeting him? Finally, Henry sighed. "All right, I'll come by." Jacob's smile widened. "Good. I'll send a car to pick you up tomorrow morning." With that, he turned and walked back to the SUV. Within moments, he was gone, leaving Henry standing there, staring at the Ferrari, the envelope still clutched in his hand. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the man, Charles Donovan. He had saved his life, sure, but why was he going to such lengths to repay him? Something about it felt off. But at the same time, There was a curiosity growing in Henry's mind. Who was this man really? And why did he want to meet so badly? The next morning, right on time, a sleek black car rolled up his driveway. A driver in a suit stepped out and opened the door for him. Henry took a deep breath, adjusting his worn flannel shirt before climbing inside. The ride was long, winding, through roads Henry had never been down before. The city was far behind now, replaced by rolling hills and sprawling estates. Eventually, the car pulled up to massive iron gates that opened automatically. Beyond them lay a mansion so large, Henry couldn't wrap his head around it. The driver stopped in front of the grand entrance, where Jacob was already waiting. "Right this way, Mr. Carter," he said smoothly, leading him inside. The place was overwhelming. High ceilings, marble floors, walls lined with expensive artwork. It was a different world, one Henry had never stepped into before. Jacob led him down a hallway to a large room where a man sat by a window overlooking the estate. His face was sharp, his hair neatly combed back, but there was something tired in his eyes. When he turned, Henry recognized him instantly. "Mr. Carter," Charles Donovan said, his voice warm. "I'm so glad you came." Henry gave a small nod. "Figured I ought to." Charles chuckled. "I owe you my life." He gestured toward the seat across from him. "Please, sit." Henry sat, feeling the weight of the situation settling on him. Charles leaned forward, folding his hands together. "I wanted to meet you because men like you, they're rare." His eyes held something unreadable. "You saved me without hesitation. That's not something I forget." Henry shifted. "Like I said, anyone would have done it." Charles studied him for a moment before shaking his head. "No, they wouldn't have." Henry's stomach tightened. "Ask me for what?" Charles exhaled slowly, looking out the window. "I need your help." Henry frowned. "With what?" Charles turned back to him, his expression unreadable. "There's something going on, something dangerous, and I don't know who else I can trust." Henry's heart pounded. He had walked into something much bigger than he had expected, and now, whether he liked it or not, he was caught in the middle of it. Henry felt the weight of Charles Donovan's words settle over him like a heavy fog. Something dangerous, someone he could trust. Those weren't the kind of words Henry expected to hear from a man who lived in a mansion with a fleet of luxury cars. Henry leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Mr. Donovan, I'm just a farmer. I don't know what kind of trouble you're in, but I doubt I'm the man to help you." Charles gave a tired smile, as if he had already anticipated Henry's reluctance. "You don't know me, Mr. Carter, but I've spent my life around people who smile to my face and wait for the moment to stab me in the back." He exhaled slowly. "My business, my wealth, it's made me powerful. But power comes with enemies, and right now, I don't know who's on my side." Henry frowned. "What does that have to do with me?" Charles looked him in the eye. "Because you're the only person in a long time who helped me without expecting anything in return." He gestured around the lavish room. "I've learned that money can buy almost everything, but not loyalty, not real honesty." Henry let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't used to this kind of talk. He wasn't some bodyguard or investigator. He was just a man who worked the land, who lived simply. But the way Charles spoke, there was a desperation there, a loneliness. Finally, Henry said, "All right, what exactly do you need help with?" Charles hesitated, as if debating how much to say. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The accident. It wasn't an accident." Henry's stomach tightened. Charles continued, "Someone tampered with my car, cut the brakes. If I hadn't crashed where I did, I wouldn't have made it." He paused. "I have my suspicions about who's behind it. but I can't trust anyone in my circle. Not yet. I need someone outside of it. Someone with no ties to my world. Henry sat there, trying to make sense of it all. He had assumed he had just been in the right place at the right time when he pulled Charles out of that wreck. But now it was clear. He had stepped into something much bigger. I don't know the first thing about finding out who's after you, Henry admitted. Charles smiled faintly. I don't expect you to. I just need someone who won't lie. To me. He leaned back. I had my team look into you, Henry. You've lived an honest life. No debts, no enemies, no skeletons in your closet. That's rare. And that's why I trust you. Henry let out a slow breath. He could feel himself getting pulled into this deeper. But something in his gut told him Charles wasn't lying. He was a man used to control. And right now, he was grasping at whatever he could to keep himself safe. After a long silence, Henry finally said, All right, I'll help however I can. But I'm no detective, and I'm sure not a rich man's security guard. Charles chuckled. That's what makes you the perfect person for this. The next few days were unlike anything Henry had ever experienced. He was introduced to Charles's closest associates, business partners, assistants, lawyers. Henry kept his ears open, observing how they spoke, how they looked at Charles. He didn't know much about the world of wealth and power, but he knew people, and something felt off. Then, late one evening, Henry was walking through the estate's gardens when he overheard a hushed conversation near the guest house. He ducked behind a hedge, listening. He's getting too close. We need to act fast. Henry's heart pounded. He recognized the voice. It was Jacob, the same man who had delivered the Ferrari to his farm. Henry didn't wait. He hurried back to the house and found Charles in his study. It's Jacob, he said firmly. He's the one setting you up. Charles's face hardened, but there was no shock in his eyes. I had my suspicions. That night, Charles confronted Jacob. Security cameras caught everything. The way Jacob tried to deny it, the way his face paled when Charles laid out the evidence. It turned out Jacob had been working with one of Charles's business rivals, trying to take him out and seize control of key investments. Jacob was arrested, and just like that, the storm passed. The next morning, as Henry prepared to leave, Charles met him at the front steps. I don't know how to thank you, he said. Henry smirked. You already tried with a Ferrari. Charles laughed. And you turned it down. He grew serious. You saved my life twice, Henry. If you ever need anything, you call me. Henry nodded. I appreciate that, but I think I'll stick to farming. Charles extended a hand, and Henry shook it. Then with a final glance at the mansion, Henry climbed into the waiting car that would take him home. As the rolling fields came back into view, he let out a deep breath. He had walked into a world of wealth, danger, and deception, and somehow he had made it through. But at the end of the day, all he wanted was the quiet life he had always known. When he arrived back at his farm, he found something unexpected waiting for him. Not another Ferrari, just a simple handwritten note. You reminded me of who I used to be. Take care, my friend. Charles. Henry smiled, tucking the note into his pocket. He may not have left with money or luxury, but he had gained something far more valuable. A reminder that even in a world of wealth and power, honesty still meant something.